This is Luke with Beta Alpha Psi. This video discusses major funds and determining whether to report a fund discretely on government-wide financial statements. The text used as a reference for this video is Essentials of Accounting for Governmental and Not-for-Profit Organizations, 10th edition by Paul Copley. Governments may have many different funds, including the General Fund, Capital Project Funds, Debt Service Funds, Special Revenue Funds, and Permanent Funds. The General Fund is always considered a major fund. Other funds may also need to be reported in separate columns on the government-wide financial statements. To determine this, there are two considerations. The first are qualitative. If the fund is a very high profile or has particular public interest, and maybe if it's a really controversial purpose, it should be reported discretely in its own column. Basically, if it's useful to statement readers, it should be in its own column. The more straightforward test is two parts, the 10% and the 5% test. That's what we will go over next. First, the 10% test. Total assets, liabilities, revenues, or expenditures of that individual governmental fund constitute 10% of the total for the governmental funds category. If the fund passes the 10% test, it moves on to the 5% test. Total assets, liabilities, revenues, or expenditures of that individual governmental fund constitute 5% of the total of the governmental and enterprise categories combined. Let's take a look at an example. If we have the assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenditures for an entire government, we have total government funds listed, total enterprise funds, and then three funds individually listed. The Capital Project Fund, which may be for something such as a new courthouse or a renovation. Then we have the Debt Service Fund and the Special Revenue Fund. We're going to take a closer look and test the Special Revenue Fund to see if we need to report it discretely on financial statements. First is the 10% test. Remember, total assets, liabilities, revenues, or expenditures of this individual fund will constitute 10% of the total for the governmental funds category. First, we will take the Special Revenue Fund's assets and divide by the total governmental funds assets. This gives us 20%. As you can see, this fund passes the 10% test. We will use Excel to our advantage, and we can see that liabilities and expenditures also pass this test. This doesn't matter because only one of these elements has to pass the test in order to move on to the 5% test. Since our Special Revenue Fund passed the 10% test, we move on to the 5% test. This test is less stringent because it's comparing both governmental funds and enterprise funds combined with the elements of the Special Revenue Fund. First, we will test the assets against the sum of the total enterprise funds and the total governmental funds. The 10 million in assets of the Special Revenue Fund divided by 210 million of assets of total government and total enterprise gives us 4.8%. So far, this fund has not passed the 5% test. So we must move on to liabilities. If we add governmental and enterprise funds together, we get 97 million. And then divide the 6 million of the Special Revenue Fund liabilities by the 97 million, we get 6.2%. This fund passes the 10% and 5% tests. As we did before, we use Excel and see that liabilities is the only element that passes the 5% test, but that's okay because only one of these elements has to pass it. In conclusion, some funds must be reported in a separate column. This is determined both through qualitative and quantitative measures. The 10% and 5% tests are most helpful and most direct, but other qualitative matters make a difference as well in determining whether to report a fund discretely. Thank you.